Father Speaks. Loretta Lynch's dad tells us about the Attorney General nominee's upbringing in the Baptist faith. National security. Former secretaries of state weigh in on the threats facing the U.S. and the world. Cuba-U.S. relations. Raul Castro wants Guantanamo Bay back. Will he get his wish? And sacred rap. This young New Orleans priest draws attention to church teaching in an unusual way. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, January 29th, 2015. Good evening from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Senate Republicans want a transformative change at the U.S. Justice Department. Today, they question whether President Obama's Attorney General nominee, Loretta Lynch, is up to that job. Suzanne LaFranchi was on Capitol Hill for the second day of Lynch's confirmation hearing.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Much of the witness testimony was a searing attack on Attorney General Eric Holder, not a vetting of the nominee, who wasn't required to attend the second and final day of her confirmation hearing.
For 6 years, the Department of Justice has operated as an increasingly rogue agency.
Of the 9 witnesses, 3 are involved in lawsuits against the administration, including former investigative reporter Cheryl Atkinson.
They bully and threaten access of journalists who do their jobs, news organizations that publish stories they don't like, and whistleblowers who dare to tell the truth.
Senate Republicans summoned many of the witnesses to amplify their criticism of an administration they say acts outside the Constitution. Many committee members admit they don't oppose Lynch but want to see change at the Justice Department.
We aren't here to talk about her qualifications. I don't think anybody questions that. But whether she can make changes in the Department of Justice.
When top committee Democrat Patrick Leahy asked testifying witnesses for a show of hands of those who oppose Lynch, not one hand went up. In her appearance yesterday, Lynch pledged independence from the Obama administration, promising to work with Republicans. Today, Democrats drove that message.
Do you believe that Loretta Lynch has the independence to stand up to others in the executive branch, including the president?
Former colleagues praised the nominee as an independent thinker.
She was clearly tough, but also fair and gracious.
I firmly believe that Loretta Lynch possesses all of the necessary attributes that the nation should demand of an independent attorney general.
Despite objections from some, key Senate Republicans on the committee indicate that Ms. Lynch will be approved. That confirmation could come as early as next month. From the Hart Senate Office Building, Suzanne LaFranchi, EWTN News Nightly.
And one of several family members attending the Senate confirmation hearing for Loretta Lynch was her father, a fourth-generation Baptist minister. The Reverend Lorenzo Lynch grew up hearing his father preach. He was elected pastor of White Rock Baptist Church in 1965. Just 2 years later, their building was demolished because of urban renewal. Lynch led the planning, fundraising, and construction of a new church building. He talked with our Suzanne LaFranchi today about the grit that fuels his family.
What did you and your wife do to raise a daughter like this?
It was sort of unconscious. We were ourselves. We were both reared in poverty, and we were both reared under the strict rules of ethics. When we did wrong, we were whipped, and we were preached to by our parents. Stay out of trouble, choose good friends, don't fight. You know, we were brought up with that kind of stuff. So it was sort of unconscious on our part. We didn't say we want to raise a famous daughter. We just did what we thought was right and what we thought was best.
Reverend Lynch says his daughter got to visit with President Obama today and have her picture taken at the White House. He will return to North Carolina tomorrow. And we will share more of the one-on-one interview with Reverend Lorenzo Lynch tomorrow here on EWTN News Nightly. Now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. A life and death showdown with the Islamic State is looming as a prisoner swap deadline passes. Jason Calvi joins us now with that story.
Brian, while the lives of those 2 hostages hang in the balance, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee receives a top-secret briefing on the fight against ISIS. It comes as former secretaries of state share their expertise with another Senate committee. Elder U.S. statesmen warn Congress about the threat of the Islamic State.
Its aim, the overthrow of all existing institutions.
Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger was greeted by protesters. Madeleine Albright says Congress should weigh in on using force to fight ISIS, one of President Obama's points in his State of the Union address.
I think it is very important for there to be more education of the American public as to what the stakes are.
This father of an ISIS hostage knows the stakes all too well.
Releasing your Muslim brother is going to receive a big positive reaction and appreciation from all Jordanian and Palestinian tribes who share the same faith as you.
ISIS says they'll kill him if Jordan doesn't free a woman convicted of plotting terror. The Jordanian government says they'd agree to the exchange.
We want to see a proof of life of the Jordanian pilot, and then we can talk about the exchange.
That spokesman says his government is working with Japan to save Japanese journalist Kenji Goto. He went to Syria to save a colleague from ISIS and ended up in their hands himself. Brian, the secretaries talked about several other foreign policy issues. Former Reagan Secretary of State George Shultz warns that Iran wants a nuclear missile so it can attack Israel. Another committee today moves forward a bill that would place even more sanctions against Iran if those nuclear negotiations fail. Brian?
Our Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Jason. Well, as his former teammates prepare for Sunday's Super Bowl, former New England Patriots receiver Aaron Hernandez is now on trial for murder in Boston. He is pleading not guilty to the killing of Odin Lloyd in 2013. Lloyd was dating the sister of the fiancé of Hernandez. This week's blizzard delayed the opening statements in this trial. The judge will block any mention that 25-year-old Hernandez was indicted for 2 other murders in Boston. He caught a touchdown pass when the Patriots last played at the Super Bowl 3 years ago. Jury selection for the Boston Marathon bombing suspect resumes today, also delayed by this week's Boston blizzard. Yohar Zanayev is charged with the 2013 bombing near the iconic marathon's finish line. 3 people died, more than 260 were injured. The judge had hoped to question 40 potential jurors daily, but it's only been an average of 14 so far. Malaysia's government declares missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 an accident, and all 239 on board are now presumed dead. Malaysian officials say the search for the jet will remain a priority, but the compensation process for the families of the victims can now move forward. Flight 370 disappeared in March after taking off from Kuala Lumpur en route to Beijing. It's believed the plane crashed in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Australia. In spite of an exhaustive search, not a single trace of that plane has been found. Indonesian investigators say the co-pilot was flying Air Asia Flight 8501 when it crashed in the Java Sea last month. He was less experienced than the pilot, with about a quarter of the flying hours. The black boxes are helping to provide a clearer picture of what went wrong with the flight. They indicate it was in distress for the final 3 minutes and 20 seconds. All 162 on board were killed. 72 bodies have been recovered so far. A powerful gas explosion shattered a Mexico City maternity and children's hospital today. We know that at least 2 people have died. The blast destroyed a large part of the building, sending a plume of smoke over the area. The city's mayor says the explosion was apparently caused by a leak in a hose that was carrying gas from a truck into the hospital. At least 54 people were injured, 22 of them children. Pope Francis will no longer present the traditional pallium to metropolitan archbishops at a formal ceremony in Rome. The Pope has decided that the apostolic nuncio will conduct the vesting ceremony in the home archdiocese of each archbishop. Francis is still inviting each new archbishop to join him in Rome on June 29th to celebrate the Mass on the feasts of Saints Peter and St. Paul. The Pope will bless each pallium and present the vestment to archbishops who are present privately after the Mass. The wearing of the pallium, a white woolen strip worn around the neck, dates back to the 4th century. It symbolizes the bond between an archbishop and the Pope. Alan Holdren joins us from a rainy Rome tonight to talk more about this. Alan, from what you're hearing there, why is the Pope making this change?
Well, his Master of Ceremonies, Monsignor Guido Marini, explained it to Vatican Radio today after the news hit the stands, that this is to create greater synodality, to create greater communion between the Bishop of Rome, the Pope himself, and these bishops from throughout the world. They're from the major cities of the world, and the Pope wants to show them with this gesture that he's actually closer to them.
How interesting. And what benefit might there be to having this ceremony in the home archdiocese instead of thousands of miles away from the faithful in the Vatican?
Oh, yeah, I think you said it exactly right. It's thousands of miles away from the faithful in the Vatican. So a lot of people who can't take part in the celebration. So from what Monsignor Marini said to Vatican Radio today, he said that the Pope, after a lot of reflection and also after having requested advice, decided to make this move to almost double the festivities. There will be a celebration still here in Rome. Nothing's lost. The Pope will give this special vestment to each of these metropolitan archbishops, bishops from the major cities of the world. He'll give it to them in person and in private, which he had done it in public before during this Mass. After he gives it to them, they'll take it home to the home archdiocese, and with the papal delegate to the nation that these people are from, called the nuncio, they'll decide on a date where they can have a public ceremony to publicly celebrate this communion with the Pope. So it's really twice the celebration that the Pope has given these new archbishops.
Great point. Our Rome correspondent, Alan Holdren. Thanks for joining us tonight, Alan.
Thank you, Brian.
And Pope Francis says church leaders who form cliques and scorn others are not following the way of Jesus. His comment came during his homily at this morning's Mass at his Santa Marta Vatican residence. Francis warned against groups he calls ecclesial elites. The Holy Father says, quote, "When these small groups are created within the community of God's people, these people believe they are being good Christians and also are acting in good faith maybe, but they are small groups who have privatized salvation." Coming up, will the U.S. give up its Guantanamo Bay military base to improve diplomatic relations with Cuba? And we look at some beautiful Renaissance sacred art on the auction block today. We're very grateful you could join us on this Thursday evening, January 29th. I'm Brian Patrick with the EWTN News Nightly team. The Republican-controlled Senate passes a bipartisan bill approving construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline. The vote advanced a top priority of the GOP despite a presidential veto threat. Support for the bill falls short of the threshold needed to override a veto. The measure must also still be reconciled with the House version. The bill authorizes construction of the nearly 1,200-mile pipeline. It would carry oil primarily from Canada's tar sands to Gulf Coast refineries. Critics argue the $8 billion project spells disaster for global warming. Supporters call it a jobs bill that will boost America's energy security. Cuba's leader demands the U.S. hand over its Guantanamo Bay military base. Raul Castro says closing that base must happen if diplomatic ties between the two countries are to be restored. Wyatt Goolsby is here tonight with that story.
Brian, it's not just Guantanamo Bay he wants. President Castro also says the U.S. must lift its trade embargo on Cuba and compensate his country for decades of damages.
U.S. diplomats are hoping Castro's list of demands won't derail diplomatic efforts. Former Cuban President Fidel Castro said this week, "I don't trust U.S. policies and have not exchanged a word with them." But he says he would not oppose a peaceful solution. Last month, Cuba and the U.S. exchanged prisoners and agreed to discuss normalizing relations. Critics of the new policy cite the country's hardline communist government as a reason why restoring relations is a bad idea. Today, several senators from both parties announced they're proposing a bill to abolish all travel bans to Cuba.
There are no guarantees that this will bring democracy next year or the next, but I think it's far more likely to set conditions where democracy will come sooner.
Meanwhile, the fate of Guantanamo Bay seems uncertain. The president has vowed to close the detention camp, which holds combatants captured in Afghanistan and Iraq. The White House blames Congress for blocking his efforts. Tomas Bilbao, a Cuba expert, says the U.S. should open up economic ties with the island nation.
It's a historic shift in a policy that used to obsess solely with hurting the Cuban government towards a policy that instead obsesses over helping the Cuban people.
Bilbao says leadership by Pope Francis was key. He says opening up travel and trade will be a big help to the church, which has limited resources in Cuba.
The Catholic Church is playing increasingly an important role, not just in its evangelizing functions, but also in social functions, such as feeding the poor, helping the elderly, helping the young and vulnerable, helping train entrepreneurs, and a number of other activities where the Catholic Church is taking a lead as a social organization within Cuba.
The debate on Capitol Hill will continue next week. Senator Marco Rubio announced he will hold a hearing on the president's Cuba policy and what it means for human rights on the island. Brian.
All right, thank you, Wyatt. Renaissance masterpieces are on sale this week at Christie's, the world's largest fine arts auction house. Old Masters Week in New York features pieces like this Virgin and Child from the 1500s, worth $365,000. Much of the art depicts sacred subjects. These are works by some of the greatest portrait painters of the Italian Renaissance. The master of the legend of St. Ursula shows angels supporting the veil of St. Veronica. It's actually oil and gold on oak panel. It was appraised at $350,000, but this week someone bought it for more than $500,000. Dr. Jem Sullivan is author of The Beauty of Faith, Christian Art, and the New Evangelization. Of course, you contribute essays on our beautiful art for Magnificat magazine. You've also worked here at the National Gallery of Art in D.C. Why is Renaissance art still so popular and so powerful, really?
You know, we are in the age of the Renaissance, that incredible period of art history when we see this unparalleled flowering of artistic creativity and genius, really, in the painting, in sculpture, and in architecture. We have not yet seen this since then, since the Renaissance. And so much of the subject matter of Renaissance art is Christian in theme, in inspiration, in origin, in patronage. So it's not surprising then that we have this great interest in these beautiful masterpieces of Renaissance art.
There's so much detail and there's such spirit behind us. Tell about the Madonna of the Eucharist by Botticelli. It just sold at Christie's for almost $850,000.
That's right. Isn't that amazing? You know, the Eucharist is the source and summit of the Christian life. That was what the Second Vatican Council taught us. And in Ecclesiae de Eucharistia, St. John Paul II said that the Church draws her life from the Eucharist. I think this beautiful painting entitled The Madonna of the Eucharist is a wonderful example that brings to life these truths and of the faith. It's an exquisite 15th century Renaissance painting from the studio of Sandro Botticelli. And what we know is that Botticelli, this is around the time that he first sets up his own independent studio. He's a master painter, and so many artists would have wanted to work with him, to be his apprentice and to be his assistant. And so this painting comes to us from an artist who worked in close proximity to Botticelli and who would have been one of his assistants. It's just an exquisite gathering of three figures where we see the Madonna and Child and an angel holding up a bowl of grapes and wheat as all three of them look at this symbols of the Eucharist.
In the interest of time, I want to move on to another of these wonderful paintings, The Return of the Prodigal Son, Jacopo Bassano. What's the most significant thing about this?
You know, the most beautiful aspect of this painting is that the artist uses light and darkness to really highlight the spiritual drama of conversion and repentance on the part of the prodigal son, and also of the loving, tender mercy on the part of the father. And he uses light dramatically. There's really warm light. There's areas of darkness in the painting. But most of all, we're drawn into this drama of conversion and repentance. And we see that this theme of the prodigal son will be relevant, will echo in our hearts as long as there is division and conflict and alienation from God. The prodigal son is the image of humanity alienated and estranged from God.
It's one of my favorite parables because I relate to that son and the father welcoming, and that beautiful work of art really, really captured it. Dr. Jem Sullivan, thank you so much for the insight that you have shared with us tonight, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Up next, making a movie about the infamous late-term abortionist Kermit Gosnell. And this young priest from New Orleans is making his mark rapping for the Lord. True love does not pay attention to the evil it suffers. It rejoices in doing good. Today's tweet from Pope Francis. Good evening on this Thursday. I'm Brian Patrick with our EWTN News Nightly team. Well, it's been nearly 2 years since Philadelphia abortionist Kermit Gosnell was sentenced to life in prison. Now, filmmakers are gearing up to bring this horrific story to the big screen. They call him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Their goal is to get the story into every home in America. Husband and wife team Ann McElhinney and Phelim McAleer decided to use crowdfunding website Indiegogo to raise the money they needed for this project. They asked for $2.1 million. They've topped that now, raising $2.2 million. That makes it the most funded film ever on Indiegogo. Gosnell co-producer Ann McElhinney joins us now, a journalist who has made documentaries for the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Company. Now, to tell a good story, you need an compelling story to make a good movie. This is compelling. It's atrocious, but compelling. As a documentary producer, how will you go about developing this storyline?
Yeah, well, as you probably know, in the past we've made documentaries. This won't be a documentary. This is going to be a movie with actors and all of that. The truth is that, sometimes they say that the truth is stranger than fiction, and in this case that couldn't be more correct. Our mission is to tell the truth, which was never told before, about this incredible man, this monster, operating in plain sight in Philadelphia, and for 17 years. No one ever walked across his threshold to work out that he was actually a serial killer, killing born-alive children by stabbing them in the back with a scissors, as many of your viewers know.
So you have the facts to work with here. That's how the story will be developed. Now, your story of funding this through crowdfunding on Indiegogo, what kind of feedback did you get from so many people who contributed?
You cannot believe. I mean, you can believe. And actually, your viewers might enjoy this. To go on our site, go to gosnellmovie.com right now. Read the comments. Read what people have written who sent us money. People who wrote who had abortions in their past who have to try and live with that. One woman who wrote, you'll see it, it's like 15 comments back, who wrote and said basically that she had an abortion in the past. She cannot have children, has never had any children, and she prays for us that we will be successful, that more people will find out what happened here and what happens in general in the abortion industry. We've had amazing feedback. 26,000 people gave us money. We'd like that to be 100,000, by the way, and your viewers can send us $1. The campaign was reopened because we want to send a big message, because, by the way, this isn't a local story. This was never a local story.
In fact, the national media basically ignored it. Was that somewhat
Oh my God, that's super.
Behind you?
Very, very much
Yes.
so. My husband and I both have journalism backgrounds, and the old mantra, and I know it might be hard for your listeners to take this, but if it bleeds, it leads. That's the rule. That's the rule in journalism, except for when it comes to a narrative that the mainstream media just won't allow, that they wouldn't allow something negative we said about abortion, which this story is all about. And so they quashed the story. They called it a local story. They called it a local story. And this is at the same time, the very same time that Jodi Arias was in everyone's home every day. We found all the details of her sordid life and the murder of this one man, obviously a tragedy for his family. But this man, Kermit Gosnell, killed thousands of babies, born alive babies. And the really awful thing is we have photographs of those children. We have photographs of those children. And I'll tell you one thing that we're going to do. We're going to make sure that those children's lives mattered, that those children will be remembered. We were just talking earlier about a Holocaust. The Holocaust, we recently had the commemoration of Holocaust. This is your American Holocaust, right here in Philadelphia in plain sight. People need to know about it.
And you and your husband will tell this story in Gosnell. You can go to gosnellmovie.com to make a contribution or to just find out more.
Yes.
Ann McElhinney, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And finally tonight, meet the rapping priest, Father Joshua Johnson, a priest for the Archdiocese of New Orleans.
Forget that nonsense, stick cavalry across the straight up fight. Show that when the devil tries to attack, I say full move on. Over your life ain't always fair, Paul compared it to a race. Had to understand, I would have lost it without his grace. See, many came before
Father Joshua uses rap to connect with youth. His video has nearly 40,000 views, and he's being invited to talk about it even in the secular media. Until tomorrow, we encourage you to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again on YouTube. For our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick, and we leave you tonight with some of the beautiful views from Rome, the Castel Sant'Angelo and St. Peter's Square. Good night and God bless you.